December 18, 1970. The Norwegian Sea, 200 meters beneath a steel-grey surface that the crew of Project 61 Ancha, NATO designation Papa class, would not see for another 6 hours. The submarine's commanding officer stood in the central command post, studying the depth gauge with the focused attention of a man who had just achieved what Western intelligence analysts would later classify as impossible. The air inside the titanium pressure hull carried the acrid chemical scent of lead-bismuth coolant, a smell that had become as familiar as seawater to the 180 men sealed inside this experimental vessel. Temperature gauges throughout the engineering compartment read 43 degrees Celsius. The reactor spaces were hotter. K-222 had just completed her high-speed trials. 44.7 knots submerged. No submarine in the world had ever moved faster underwater. The liquid metal reactor had performed exactly as the designers at Malachite's Central Design Bureau promised it would, delivering power that turned the twin 7-bladed propellers into instruments of hydrodynamic violence. The commanding officer allowed himself a moment of professional satisfaction. His vessel could outrun any torpedo the Americans possessed. She could chase down their attack submarines and dictate engagement ranges. She had just rewritten the tactical doctrine of underwater warfare. Then the sonar operator raised his hand. Not a shout, not an alarm, just a raised hand and a face that had gone the color of old paper. The commanding officer crossed the control room in 4 steps. The sonar display showed return signatures at bearing 090, range 12,000 meters. Multiple contacts. American Los Angeles-class attack submarines, judging from the acoustic profile. They were traveling at flank speed, directly toward K-222's position. Impossible. K-222 had been running silent for the past 40 minutes, making barely 8 knots, well below the threshold, where her revolutionary propulsion system generated detectable cavitation noise. She had crossed 3 separate thermal layers, specifically selected to deflect active sonar pulses. The Norwegian Sea in December offered acoustic conditions that should have rendered her invisible to passive detection systems. The commanding officer checked the chronometer. The Americans were closing at their maximum speed, not searching, hunting. The weapons officer reported all torpedo tubes ready. The commanding officer ordered a course change to bearing 180, speed increasing to 20 knots. K-222's hull groaned as the reactor spooled up, pumping superheated liquid metal through heat exchangers that fed steam to turbines generating 50,000 shaft horsepower. The submarine accelerated with a velocity that pressed men against bulkheads. 30 knots, 35. The tactical advantage that made K-222 legendary. The sonar operator's second raised hand came 6 minutes later. The American submarines had matched the course change, bearing 185 still closing, range now 8,000 meters. The commanding officer felt something cold settle in his chest. They were not reacting to K-222's maneuvers. They had anticipated them. He ordered another course change, this time to bearing 270, speed maintained at 35 knots. The submarine carved through the water column with the brutal efficiency of her titanium hull and experimental propellers. 3 minutes passed. The American contacts adjusted their heading to bearing 275. As if they had known. As if they were reading his orders before he gave them. The realization arrived with the clinical clarity of a medical diagnosis. The Americans were not searching for K-222. They had already found her. They were demonstrating that they could track the fastest submarine ever built through any evasive maneuver her commanding officer could conceive. They were waiting to see what else he would try. If you are enjoying this investigation into history's hidden conflicts, please verify your subscription to the channel Cold War Chronicles. We declassify the past to understand the present. The commanding officer ordered K-222 to diving depth, 300 meters, and reduce speed to 6 knots. The American submarines maintained their formation, now at range 5,000 meters, perfectly positioned to intercept any attempt to reach international waters. For 23 minutes, K-222 drifted in the thermal layer, while her commanding officer confronted the tactical reality. His vessel, the pride of Soviet naval engineering, the submarine that could outrun torpedoes, had been tracked with casual precision by an enemy who should not have been able to detect her at all. The humiliation of the forced retreat would appear in his official report as training exercise concluded successfully. The truth would travel through different channels, in folders stamped with red classification markings that would cross desks in Moscow by the end of the week. Captain First Rank Anatoly Mikhailovich Pustintsev, commander of Project 671RT attack submarine, moving through the Barents Sea on January 9, 1971, experienced his own version of the nightmare when American P-3 Orion maritime patrol aircraft appeared directly above his position, despite textbook adherence to silent running protocols. The Orion dropped a pattern of sonobuoys that formed a perfect acoustic fence around his submarine's projected course. Not searching. Waiting. Commander of a Project 670 Scat cruise missile submarine operating near the GIUK Gap on February 3, 1971, reported American destroyers vectoring toward his position within minutes of departing Severomorsk Naval Base. The destroyers maintained contact for 11 hours through 3 separate evasion attempts, including a high-speed sprint beneath a Norwegian merchant convoy. Captain Second Rank commanding Project 675 guided missile submarine, March 1971, Greenland Sea. American attack submarine maintaining trail position at distance of 2,000 meters for 6 hours. When the Soviet captain attempted emergency deep dive to 400 meters, the American vessel matched the maneuver within 90 seconds, as if anticipating it. The pattern recognition occurred simultaneously in multiple offices within the Soviet Naval Staff headquarters on Znamenka Street in Moscow. Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Navy, received the Consolidated Intelligence Summary on March 18, 1971. The conference room on the building's 3rd floor smelled of cigarette smoke and the peculiar institutional odor of anxiety. 16 separate incidents documented in the first quarter of 1971 alone. 16 Soviet submarines detected, tracked, and in several cases actively harassed by NATO forces that should not have been able to locate them. The intelligence officers presented theories with the careful language of men who understood that wrong answers carried professional consequences. American satellite reconnaissance achieving thermal imaging capability beyond current Soviet estimates. Improved sonar processing, allowing passive detection at previously impossible ranges. Potential acoustic signatures from new reactor cooling systems. Each theory examined and documented with mathematical precision. Each theory failing to explain how American forces repeatedly appeared at exact intercept points before Soviet submarines arrived. Captain Second Rank in the Naval Intelligence Directorate proposed that NATO had developed long-range wake detection technology. The mathematics supported the possibility. Submarines moving through water created pressure disturbances that propagated to the surface. Theoretical models suggested these disturbances might remain detectable for hours under specific oceanographic conditions. The Admiral ordered feasibility studies. A commander from the main naval staff suggested compromise of submarine departure schedules through human intelligence penetration. The KGB's 3rd Chief Directorate began reviewing security protocols at every Northern Fleet submarine base. Sailors faced interrogations that lasted for days. Officers found their personal correspondence examined for signs of foreign contact. The paranoia metastasized through the submarine community like radiation through tissue. Submarine crews returning from patrol reported the psychological weight of operating under continuous surveillance. They described the sensation of being watched by an enemy they could not locate, tracked by methods they could not understand, hunted in an environment that should have protected them. The iron coffins had become glass coffins, visible to an enemy who somehow saw through steel and seawater and the crushing pressure of the deep ocean. In a secure facility outside Moscow, Engineers reviewed the technical specifications of K-222's liquid metal reactor and her unprecedented speed capabilities. If the fastest submarine ever built could be tracked and cornered, what protection remained for the conventional boats? How were the Americans finding them? The answer arrived not through brilliant deduction, but through catastrophic mechanical failure aboard the submarine that had started the investigation. May 22, 1971. K-222 remained docked at Severomorsk Naval Base, her titanium hull reflecting the pale Arctic sunlight, while engineering crews worked inside compartments that had become progressively more dangerous with each operational patrol. The liquid metal coolant system, lead-bismuth eutectic alloy, maintained at temperatures exceeding 300 degrees Celsius, had developed leaks that no amount of welding could permanently seal. The chief engineer submitted his report with hands that trembled from more than cold. 8 separate breaches in the primary coolant loop. Toxic metal vapor escaping into the engineering compartment at concentrations that exceeded safety thresholds by factors of 12. Crew members exhibiting symptoms consistent with heavy metal poisoning. Tremors, cognitive impairment, lesions on exposed skin where lead-bismuth particles had made contact. The radiation exposure levels remained classified, but the engineering crew's medical records documented white blood cell counts that suggested the reactor shielding had proven inadequate during high-speed operations. The speed record that had made K-222 legendary had been achieved by men breathing vaporized lead. The tactical advantage had cost them their bone marrow. Admiral Gorshkov ordered a comprehensive technical review of all experimental reactor systems currently in service or under development. The review would eventually encompass 47 separate engineering studies, but in May 1971, the focus remained fixed on understanding why the Americans could track Soviet submarines with such precision. The liquid metal coolant leaks aboard K-222 represented a failure of engineering, not a failure of stealth. The submarine detection problem remained unsolved. The Naval Intelligence Directorate compiled data from signals intelligence intercepts, submarine patrol reports, and debriefings of every commanding officer who had experienced unexplained detection events. The analysis revealed geographical patterns. American forces demonstrated highest tracking accuracy in specific ocean areas. The Norwegian Sea approaches to the GIUK Gap, the Barents Sea north of Murmansk, the transit routes between Severomorsk and the Atlantic patrol areas. These were precisely the corridors Soviet submarines had to traverse to reach their operational zones. A captain in the intelligence section proposed a theory that initially seemed too simple to be correct. What if the Americans were not detecting submarines through advanced sensor technology? What if they were simply waiting in predetermined locations along known transit routes? The theory presumed extensive knowledge of Soviet naval operations, patrol schedules, and departure patterns. It presumed a level of intelligence penetration that contradicted every assumption about operational security. The KGB investigations intensified. Security officers examined communication protocols at submarine bases throughout the Northern Fleet. They reviewed personnel assignments, cross-referenced family connections, analyzed patterns of shore leave and personal contacts. They found nothing that explained the American tracking capability. The witch hunt consumed hundreds of investigative hours and destroyed several careers through guilt by association, but it produced no evidence of systemic intelligence compromise. Meanwhile, K-222 remained at dock while engineers attempted to redesign the coolant containment system. The modifications required cutting through sections of the titanium pressure hull, a procedure that compromised the structural integrity that allowed the submarine to operate at extreme depths. Each repair introduced new potential failure points. The design that had achieved unprecedented underwater speed was proving impossible to maintain under operational conditions. The commanding officer of K-222 faced a decision that would define the remainder of his naval career. Soviet naval leadership demanded the submarine return to operational status. The speed trials had demonstrated tactical capabilities that the Americans could not match. The detection problem affected all Soviet submarines, not just K-222. Political pressure from the Ministry of Defense insisted that the Papa-class design represented the future of underwater warfare, despite the mounting evidence of its catastrophic flaws. The crew medical reports told a different story. 19 men from the engineering section exhibited symptoms requiring extended hospitalization. Blood tests revealed lead concentrations that would cause permanent neurological damage. Radiation dosimetry badges, worn during the December speed trials, showed exposure levels that exceeded annual limits by factors of 3. The submarine that could outrun torpedoes was poisoning the men who operated her. In June 1971, a commander from the Soviet naval staff visited Severomorsk to inspect K-222 personally. He descended through the forward hatch into the command compartment, where residual heat from the reactor spaces raised ambient temperature to 38 degrees Celsius, even with the reactor shut down. The chemical smell of lead-bismuth permeated every surface. In the engineering compartment, he observed the crystalline deposits where vaporized metal had condensed on cooler surfaces, beautiful and toxic. The inspection report acknowledged what the engineering crews already knew. The liquid metal reactor technology worked exactly as designed under laboratory conditions. It delivered unprecedented power density. It allowed speeds that conventional pressurized water reactors could not achieve. It also required maintenance procedures so complex and dangerous that operational deployment would inevitably result in crew casualties that exceeded acceptable parameters. The definition of acceptable parameters remained subject to interpretation. Soviet submarine doctrine had always prioritized tactical capability over crew comfort. Nuclear submarine operations inherently involved radiation exposure levels that Western navies would not tolerate. The question was not whether K-222 posed risks to her crew. All submarines posed risks, but whether those risks could be justified by corresponding tactical advantages. That calculation changed when intelligence analysts presented new data suggesting the Americans had developed methods to track K-222 specifically because of her unique propulsion system. The liquid metal reactor generated thermal signatures different from conventional submarines. The lead-bismuth coolant, when it leaked into seawater through hull penetrations, created chemical traces that might be detectable through specialized sensors. The very technology that made K-222 fast was potentially making her visible. The theory remained unproven, but it introduced doubt into calculations that had previously seemed straightforward. If K-222's experimental reactor actually compromised her stealth characteristics, then her speed advantage became meaningless. A submarine that could be tracked could be targeted. A submarine that could be targeted could be destroyed, regardless of how fast she could run. Admiral Gorshkov convened a technical conference in Moscow to evaluate whether series production of Papa-class submarines should proceed as planned. 12 submarines were scheduled for construction. The conference would determine whether the Soviet Union committed resources to building a fleet of the fastest attack submarines in the world, or whether K-222 would remain a singular experimental vessel, the achievement of engineering that proved too dangerous and possibly too detectable for operational deployment. How did the Americans keep finding Soviet submarines? The technical conference convened July 14, 1971, in a secured room within the main naval staff building, where strategic decisions emerged from collision between engineering reality and political necessity. Admiral Gorshkov sat at the head of a table, surrounded by submarine designers from Malachite Design Bureau, reactor specialists from the Ministry of Medium Machine Building, operational commanders from the Northern Fleet, and intelligence officers carrying folders documenting every instance of American tracking success during the previous 8 months. The question before them was not whether K-222 represented a technical achievement. The speed record proved that conclusively, but whether that achievement could be transformed into tactical advantage, given the catastrophic maintenance requirements and the unexplained detection problem that plagued every Soviet submarine regardless of design. The chief designer from Malachite presented data with the defensive precision of a man whose professional reputation depended on convincing skeptical admirals that liquid metal reactor technology remained viable despite mounting evidence to the contrary. The lead-bismuth coolant system could be redesigned with improved containment seals. The toxic vapor problem could be mitigated through enhanced ventilation systems and protective equipment for engineering crews. The radiation shielding could be upgraded using materials not available when K-222 was originally constructed. Each modification would add weight, reduce speed, increase complexity, and extend construction timelines by an estimated 18 months per vessel. A captain from the Northern Fleet Submarine Command offered operational perspective. K-222's speed advantage provided tactical options unavailable to conventional submarines. She could sprint to intercept American carrier battle groups. She could pursue and destroy enemy submarines attempting to evade engagement. She could transit the GIUK gap in timeframes that reduced exposure to NATO anti-submarine forces. These capabilities justified accepting elevated risk to crew health and mechanical reliability. The intelligence officer presented the argument that ended the discussion. He laid out photographs on the conference table showing K-222's titanium hull at dock in Severomorsk. The photographs had been taken by American reconnaissance satellites. The next series of photographs showed heat signatures detected during K-222's December speed trials, thermal blooms visible from orbit where superheated reactor coolant transferred energy through the hull into surrounding seawater. The Americans were not detecting K-222 through acoustic signatures or wake patterns. They were watching her from space. The thermal signature problem applied specifically to liquid metal reactor technology. Conventional pressurized water reactors operated at lower temperatures with better thermal insulation. The lead-bismuth coolant in K-222's reactor ran hot enough to create infrared signatures detectable through satellite-based sensors that the Soviet intelligence services had not known existed until American technical capabilities were reassessed following the submarine tracking incidents. Every time K-222 operated her reactor at high power, she announced her position to satellites passing overhead every 93 minutes. This explained the pattern of American intercepts. NATO forces were not tracking Soviet submarines continuously. They were receiving periodic position updates from satellite reconnaissance, then deploying maritime patrol aircraft and attack submarines to areas where Soviet vessels had been detected. The speed at which K-222 could run became irrelevant when the Americans knew her location before she began evasive maneuvers. The implications extended beyond K-222. All Soviet submarines generated thermal signatures. The question was whether those signatures exceeded detection thresholds for American satellite sensors. Analysis suggested that conventional submarines operating at normal reactor power levels produced thermal outputs that blended with ocean background temperatures when viewed from orbit. K-222's liquid metal reactor, running at 300 degrees Celsius to achieve maximum power output, created thermal anomalies that stood out like signal flares against the cold Norwegian Sea. Admiral Gorshkov terminated the series production program on July 20, 1971. The decision appeared in classified naval construction orders as postponement pending resolution of technical issues, but the engineering community understood the reality. K-222 would remain the only Papa-class submarine ever built. The fastest submarine in the world had become a tactical liability because her speed required reactor temperatures that made her visible to an enemy watching from above. K-222 remained in service, but her operational profile changed fundamentally. No more high-speed trials. No more attempts to demonstrate her ability to outrun American torpedoes. She operated at reduced power settings that kept reactor temperatures below satellite detection thresholds. She became an experimental platform for testing equipment rather than a frontline attack submarine. Her crew continued to suffer from lead-bismuth exposure despite improved ventilation systems. The liquid metal coolant continued to leak despite repeated repairs. The commanding officer who had achieved the speed record received promotion and transfer to a shore command position. He had not failed in his mission. He had commanded K-222 during trials that proved Soviet engineering could achieve performance levels the Americans could not match. That the achievement came with costs in crew health and tactical vulnerability did not diminish the technical accomplishment. In Soviet naval culture, the willingness to accept extreme risks in pursuit of tactical advantage was not a flaw, but a feature. The submarine detection problem that had initiated the investigation remained partially solved. American satellite reconnaissance explained many of the tracking incidents, but not all of them. Some Soviet submarines with conventional reactors had been tracked with precision that suggested detection methods beyond thermal imaging. The Naval Intelligence Directorate continued analyzing patrol reports, searching for patterns that might reveal other American sensor capabilities. K-222 was finally decommissioned in 1988. Her liquid metal reactor shut down permanently after 17 years of progressively more limited operations. The reactor compartment required special handling during decommissioning because the lead-bismuth coolant had solidified into radioactive metal that could not be safely removed. The submarine that outran torpedoes ended her service as a toxic monument to the Cold War principle that tactical advantage justified any cost, including the health of the men who operated the weapon systems. The crew members who served aboard K-222 during her speed trials received medical monitoring for conditions associated with heavy metal poisoning and radiation exposure. Some developed cancers that appeared in medical records with the bureaucratic notation service-related illness. The documentation acknowledged cause without assigning responsibility. They had been part of an experiment that achieved its technical objectives while demonstrating that some achievements carry prices too high for sustained deployment. The speed record still stands. 44.7 knots submerged. No submarine has ever moved faster underwater. The record represents both the pinnacle of Soviet submarine engineering and the proof that Cold War competition drove both superpowers toward technologies so dangerous that the men operating them became test subjects in experiments measuring the acceptable boundaries of human exposure to industrial toxins and ionizing radiation in pursuit of tactical superiority that satellite reconnaissance rendered obsolete before the submarines left port.